So let's kind of review the Stamp Act, because this will be obviously a big part of your test as well. We mentioned it in the midst of colonial agitation over the passage of all those previous acts. Parliament adopted the Stamp Act of 1765. They used it as a way to raise revenue for the defense of the colonies, and this act affected more colonists than any other act they had passed. And what it did is it levied a tax on licenses, all types of licenses, such as newspapers, advertisements, legal documents like deeds to land or mortgages on property, marriage licenses, those types of things, even college diplomas and playing cards. And all such licenses had to bear that stamp showing the tax had been paid. Now, a key point to this that you're going to need to know is, in fairness to Prime Minister Grenville, he did give the colonists a full year to propose a more acceptable way to tax them. He was willing to listen to them, give them some representation, so to speak. Unfortunately, the colonists failed to suggest an alternative to taxes, because I don't think they just wanted taxes in general. And because of that, Grenville was kind of surprised when the uproar came about on this Stamp Act, because he said, gee, I gave these guys a chance to come up with something different, and they didn't. Well, the bottom line was they didn't want taxes. Now we'll kind of review this and make sure you have this. This is important to know the difference between a direct tax and an indirect tax. The Stamp Act was definitely a direct tax. That would be tax that would be paid directly to the British government. And the colonists had been used to paying indirect taxes. And those were taxes that were included in the price paid by the purchaser of a product. So usually the indirect tax was hidden in the cost of the item that the person purchased. And one example we used is if you go to Blair's and they're selling 3 boxes of cereal, it says 3 for $10. If you went up and bought those 3 boxes of cereal, you would only pay the $10. You wouldn't pay tax on top of that. But I can assure you that the fellow that owns that place is going to make some money on that cereal. So what he's done is he's kind of hidden that tax in the price. So he's not making a lot of money because it's on sale, but that's how he's kind of covering himself on the tax. Now, the indirect tax was more acceptable, like we said. The colonists were used to paying that, and who did that tax go to? Did it go to the government? Went to the seller, just like the fellow at Blair's makes it, okay? Now, again, the Stamp Act was a direct tax because it was added to the price of an item that was imported in, or an item that, you know, basically needed to be stamped, okay? And it depended on that was. So the British government was making the money on that. Then we talked about taxation without representation, right? Did we get into that yesterday? I can't remember. We did. Okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, so that'll be new today. Now, believe it or not, the 13 colonies also paid direct taxes. They paid taxes that went directly to what? Not the British government, but if you're in Connecticut and you paid direct taxes, where did your tax money go? To the government of Connecticut. Well, why didn't they complain about that? Why were they okay with those direct taxes, but not the ones that were going to the British government? Okay, what?
It stayed in the colony or the...
Close. What's that? Well, that's true, but you're getting the right idea, but think about it. Look at this subtopic we're talking about, kind of.
They were represented.
That's right. They were able to choose the people that were in the legislature assembly, just like we are now. So they didn't mind that. These direct taxes were accepted by the colonists because these taxes were levied by colonial assemblies, which were set up to ensure self-government in each colony, and each colonist had a voice in the actions taken by the assemblies because they voted for those people to get in. So they weren't being taxed without representation, even though they were paying a direct tax. But they accepted it because they had some say in the way it was. Now, the Stamp Act was levied by Great Britain, and the colonists had no representatives in the English Parliament. As a result, they considered this an unacceptable tax because it violated the colonists' right to tax themselves. Okay, they had no say in it. Now, the Stamp Act tax was also levied without the consent of their own colonial representatives. those people they elected to the legislature and the assembly didn't have any say in this Stamp Act, right? Now Grenville kind of tried to do that though, didn't he, in a way? He gave them an opportunity to come up with an alternative tax, but they chose not to respond. So again, the tax that's levied without the consent of any colonial representatives or the colonists themselves is taxation without representation. So just keep that in mind. Now, so really what is the Stamp Act doing? It's taking money directly from the colonists without their consent. Perfect. So the Stamp Act was a perfect example of money being taken directly from the colonists without their consent. They have no say in it, and they were resentful towards this. Now let me give you some examples of money being taken directly from the colonists without their consent. What would settlers that bought land on the frontier have to pay a tax on, according to the Stamp Act? What are they going to pay a tax on? The deed. Very good. The deed to the property, not the land so much, because the Stamp Act's not taxing, they're taxing licenses. So if a settler decided to buy some land on the frontier, he would have to pay, on top of paying for the land, he'd have to pay a tax on his deed, which he didn't like. Okay? What would small farmers have to pay taxes on concerning to the Stamp Act? So they take their tobacco and grain to the merchant, and the merchant gives them money, and what else does he give them? You go down to Ace Hardware, you take your money, you go buy yourself, what? A receipt. They taxed the receipt because it was a license or paper product. So the receipt was taxed. So small farmers were paying taxes on warehouse receipts. When they would take their tobacco or grain in there, the warehouse would give them a receipt, and they taxed the receipt. Okay? Skilled craftsmen or workers, what would they pay taxes on? Now think about it, they're working for somebody, so what type of license, what type of things might they purchase that they would have to pay a tax on? What's that? Well, that's a good guess, but there wasn't so much then. These craftsmen were like blacksmiths and carpenters. What would they purchase they'd be taxed on? No, not so much. Remember, licenses. So if they decide they want to find out what's going on in the world today, what do they go buy? Newspaper. And they're taxed on that. Or if they got a little time, a little lunch hour, what might they do to pass the time in the lunch hour? Play cards. Play taxes on those. So even your skilled craftsmen who really didn't have anything to do with licensing still had to pay taxes for their newspapers and playing cards. And if you were a planter or a merchant or a lawyer or an editor of a newspaper, any of those types of people, you were just paying taxes left and right because you dealt with licenses all the time. So, you know, planters got to have licenses, a merchant, a lawyer, an editor of a newspaper. It was just getting crazy. So all these people felt like they were having money taken from them directly without their consent. And they didn't like it. Now, what does the British government have to do? They have to justify the Stamp Act. Why do we think that taxation without representation, due to the Stamp Act, is okay? Well, they gave three reasons. The British government gave three justifications, or three reasons, how they could justify the Stamp Act, how they could justify taking money out of the colonists' pockets without their consent. By virtue of a Stamp Act that was a taxation without representation. And here's three justifications, if you want to call it, that the British government gave for taxing without representation. The first one is they stated that Parliament represented all British subjects, including the colonists. So they're claiming in a roundabout way that you have say, because the British Parliament that makes these laws represents all English subjects, which includes you guys. Okay? So that was the first justification, is that the Parliament represented all people that lived under British rule. Who lived under British rule at this time, even though they lived across the ocean? The colonists.
But did they have any colonists in...
No, that doesn't care. That's their justification. They're just saying, hey, I'll get to that and you'll make sense in a minute there. Second thing they said which goes along with what Nick said, is not every person in Great Britain was represented in the Parliament. So what are you complaining about? You're saying that you don't have any say. Well, there's a lot of people in Great Britain that don't have any say in the Parliament. You're no different than them. So, the first reason was that Parliament represented all British subjects, including the colonists. And the second piece of justification they gave is that, hey, not everybody that lives in Great Britain is represented in Parliament, so you're no different than they are. So quit complaining.
So they just kind of turned around on what they just said?
God. No, what they're saying is that you're a British citizen, so Parliament rules you. But there are people in Great Britain, just like you, that don't have any say, except for they live here and you live over there, so you're still on equal terms, and in our opinion, you're represented. Well, you can look at it however you want. And Parliament also justified this by saying, you know what, we represent not only the citizens of Great Britain and the American colonies, but we represent every single country under the British Empire. Yep. So Parliament doesn't only represent Great Britain, and Parliament doesn't only represent the American colonies, we represent every British possession in our empire, because everybody that lives in that empire are British subjects, under the same rule as everybody else, with Parliament being the rule maker. So those are the justifications that the government gave to have taxation without representation, that they were British subjects. Even though just because they live in the colonies doesn't mean they get out of being a British subject. Secondly, not everybody else in Great Britain that lives in the country is represented in Parliament. And thirdly, everybody that's part of the British Empire, no matter where it is in the world, are British subjects and are under Parliament's rule. Well, obviously, do you think the colonists said, oh, okay, by God, you've got a point there. Yeah, you're right. No. No, they did. Not everybody, but there were people that didn't. Okay? That'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is opposition to the Stamp Act. Because we're not buying their justification. Well, what do you think? Well, I will just tell you. After this Stamp Act was passed and all the controversy came about, resolutions or petitions, so to speak, that condemned the Stamp Acts just poured into England from the colonies. Everybody that could sign a resolution or petition against these laws signed it, and they just sent them over to England like crazy. They had all kinds of complaints from the colonies. Almost all the colonies came up with a resolution or kind of a petition and signed it saying, this is wrong, we don't want to live with this. And all of the colonial assemblies. Now, I want to explain this so you understand this, and we're going to get into it later. Colonial assemblies consisted of two branches. What would they be? One's kind of repetitive. What were the two branches that made up the colonial assemblies?
The assembly.
The assembly, thank you. And the starts with an L, which you're kind of close. Legislature. Okay. Now I want to explain this to you because it's the same now when we get into next year's class. There are two houses of Congress. And some people think, well, the House of Congress is the House of Representatives. No, Congress has two houses. The House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you read in a biography that somebody served in both houses of Congress, that doesn't mean they just served in the House of Representatives, because House kind of means house. It means they served in the Senate too. So it's kind of repetitive. That's the same thing here. Colonial assemblies, a person could serve in the assembly or the legislature. If you serve in houses of Congress, you have the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're two different things. Normally, which one's more powerful today? The Senate. Which one of these would be kind of the Senate of today? The legislature. Okay? So the House is normally what a person does, not always, but sometimes you run for governor of your state. Then you get pretty saucy and think you're pretty good. And you say, I'm going to run for the House of Representatives. And then you run for the House of Representatives, you put some good time in there, and then you move up to the Senate. Now there's people that go right straight to the Senate. There's people, senators that have been elected governor. There's been members of the House that go back and run for governor. But usually it's a little bit of a progression. But I didn't much confuse. Colonial assemblies are two branches, the assembly and the legislature. Now, my point is these colonial assemblies declared that these taxes without representation were illegal unless they did what? Unless their own legislature passed them. So going back, these direct taxes levied by the Stamp Act were illegal unless you're issuing direct taxes that the Colonial Assembly has some say in, right? So basically what happened after this controversy came and opposition to the Stamp Act is Colonial Assemblies, in other words, the assembly in each of the colonies, which amounted to both the assembly and the legislature, stated publicly to Great Britain that the Stamp Act is illegal because you're doing taxation without representation. If we don't have any say, we're not pay. We don't pay. Okay? No say, won't pay. Now, in October of 1765, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York. That'd be New York City. In October of 1765, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York City. And they held a meeting there, which became known in history as the Stamp Act Congress. So, in October of 1765, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York City, and they held a meeting known as the Stamp Act Congress. And they did two things. Now this is going to seem kind of oxymoronish, so to speak. The first thing the delegates did is they first asserted their loyalty to the king and promised all due subordination to Parliament. So they first asserted their loyalty to the king and promised, quote, all due subordination to Parliament. So the first thing they did at the meeting, these 9 colonial delegates, there was actually more, there were delegates from each of the 9 colonies, they met and first asserted their loyalty to the king and promised all due subordination to Parliament. Now, if you get in trouble in this, if a teacher tells you to do something in the school and you don't do it, you are insubordinate. That's what the big fancy term is. So if you're going to be subordinate to Parliament, what are you going to be? You're going to do what they tell you. Now, think about this, because this is going to do some thinking. So delegates go there and they assert their loyalty to the king. They say, we're going to be loyal to the king because we're loyal British citizens, even though we live in the colonies. And we promise all due submission, all due subordination to Parliament. So they're saying they're going to do whatever Parliament asks. However, the second thing they state is they will resist all taxes levied without the consent of their own what? Colonial Assemblies. Okay? So what they're saying is that, we assert and we state that we're going to be loyal to the King of England and we're going to promise all due subordination to Parliament, the governing body. However, we are going to resist all taxes levied by Parliament without the consent of our own colonial assemblies, our own government, basically. They want what? Say. They want taxation with representation. I don't think they're so much against paying the tax, because they get it. If they're vowing their loyalty to the king and all due subordination to Parliament, they get it. They just don't want to be taxed without being stated, about being, have their statements. Now, this was the thing that colonial merchants did that really put heat on England. They signed non-importation agreements, which is on your ID sheet, a very important term. So as the Stamp Act Congress is meeting in New York, colonial merchants banded together and signed non-importation agreements. Non-importation agreements. And those are going to be crucial that you know what those are. Non-importation agreements. Now, Keller, What do you think that is? What, if the colonial merchants got together and signed non-importation agreements, what did they agree to? Very good, not to buy or import anything from Great Britain. Where are they going to get their goods from? Other countries. They're going to put the squeeze on it. So these merchants who are buying goods to sell are saying, we are going to sign non-importation agreements, promising each other that we will not buy nor import any British goods. So within a few months, products made in Great Britain virtually vanished from colonial stores and warehouses. There wasn't any British goods there because they weren't buying or importing any. Okay, so they just kind of band together and said, we'll squeeze them here a little. And within just a few short months, products made in Great Britain nearly or purposely vanished from colonial stores and warehouses. Now the townspeople, they rallied too. The townspeople in all these colonies, they organized societies called the Sons of Liberty. So the colonial townspeople in these colonies also banded together, kind of like the merchants did, and they organized societies or groups called the Sons of Liberty. And I'll give you some examples of the actions they took to protest this Stamp Act. So colonial townspeople took a direct step also. They organized societies or groups called the Sons of Liberty. And these are some of the things they did. One, they rioted in large towns. They rioted in large towns. What else do you think they did? What's that?